All right, welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. My name is Christopher Monsieur. I'm an associate professor in civil and environmental engineering. Today we're very pleased to have Professor Gene Hawkins from Texas A&M University. He's an OTREC visiting scholar. He's had a full half week here in Portland, Oregon. He presented to the Oregon ITE meeting on Wednesday, and then was down at ODOT headquarters and down at Oregon State University on yesterday. And today we had a tour from Peter Kuntz in the city of Portland, and now he's here for his presentation. So we've been getting we've been giving him a good tour. So Gene has been at Texas A&M for a long time. He was for 18 years at TTI before joining the faculty at Texas A&M, and he's heavily involved with the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is the body that oversees the manual on uniform traffic control devices, and what he's going to talk to us today about. So Thanks, Gene.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate it. So the first question is whether my mic is okay, and I assume they're going to fix that. So they'll say something if it's not loud enough. Being loud has never been the problem. Actually, being too loud is the problem. So if I get too loud, raise your hand and say, be quiet. My students do that every now and then. So we're going to talk about the MUTCD and the future of the document. And so first, let me explain to you about it. How many of y'all have actually held an MUTCD, have read a sentence in it, have some idea what it's about? Hold your hand up if you... Oh, okay, so that helps. Not everybody, so I won't dwell quite so much on these first couple of slides. It is one of our basic traffic engineering documents. It is essentially the Bible for traffic engineers. It's got a lot of stuff, a whole lot of stuff. It's almost 900 pages worth of stuff. And has been around for a long time. Started out in 35, and roughly every 8 years we get a new edition. And the number of pages, not surprisingly, has grown with each new edition. In fact, in 2000, we hit our all-time high of almost 1,000 pages. And then we managed to get that down in the 700-page range in 2003. How do you think we managed to reduce the size of the manual from 2000 to 2003? We got a smaller font, smaller margins, decreased the line spacing. That's exactly what we did. There was no reduction in content. Okay, we played games in order to reduce the number of pages. The current version is a 2009 edition, and when it was published as a draft in January of 2008 for public comment, essentially the first 6 or 7 months of 2008 was the comment period. And understand that in order to change the MUTCD, it goes through this process called rulemaking. It's a very cumbersome process. Involves the notice in the Federal Register, and there's a whole lot of rules and everything else. Over 1,800 people, actually I shouldn't say people, there were over 1,800 letters. Some people wrote multiple letters. So maybe not quite 1,800 people, but for the most part, 1 letter per person. And when you split those letters up into the number of comments, it broke down to over 15,000 comments. Some of those letters were over 30 pages long, commenting on proposed drafts. It has a lot of changes from the previous edition. Over 611 were identified in the Federal Register notice as significant changes. And so what happened with this 2009 manual? It's a fairly significant departure from anything that we had seen before. It's got a greater emphasis on uniformity than we've ever had. And uniformity of traffic control devices is very important. There have been situations where architects, in designing a site plan for some development, have decided that they wanted the stop sign to be green so that it would blend in with the natural vegetation. Is that a good idea? What does green mean? It means go. A green stop sign violates every basic principle of traffic control. It's not visible, it's not conspicuous, it sends conflicting messages. And so uniformity is important, but to what extent do we need to be extremely precise in our uniformity? And that's one of the big questions that we're dealing with now. The 2009 manual has tried to be more inclusive of all road users. I know in my experience this week in Portland, I've really had my eyes open to the role that some of the multimodal transportation elements can play, because, well, I come from Texas. Everybody, almost everybody, drives either a pickup truck or a large SUV. Over 50% of the vehicle fleet is probably a large vehicle, large passenger vehicle. And we drive like maniacs, okay? We just raised the speed limit on the one freeway we have in College Station from 70 to 75. The 85th percentile was already over 75 miles an hour on that freeway in free-flowing conditions. So not a lot over, so 75 is the appropriate speed based on 85th percentile. But we've got roads with 80 and 85 mile an hour speed limits on them in Texas. They're toll roads, but it's a different environment than you have here in Portland. And some of what's in this new MUTCD is trying to recognize that, recognize the older drivers, the innovation that exists out on the road, the detail I talked about is really looking at eliminating some of the options that are in the MUTCD. Trying to fine-tune what is happening with device. It used to be there are some general principles, but there are a lot of different options on what you could do with that device. And a lot of those options, flexibility, have been eliminated. And they redid a lot of the compliance dates. They have since changed the compliance dates and just eliminated a lot of it. But when the 2009 first came out, compliance dates were a critical issue. And then applied it to private property. The manual never applied to private property for it. It was applicable to publicly owned roads. Well, now, if you own a sports arena or amusement park or a shopping center parking lot or a toll road or just a road that you let people drive through between two public roads, you have any traffic control devices you use have to comply with the MUTCD according to the MUTCD. And then we added some new content, which I understand some of y'all. How many of y'all are from planning? Okay, and how many of y'all are civil engineering? And how many of y'all are something that's not from one of those two? Okay, a few. So I'm not going to go into all the details on some of this stuff, but the basic purpose of the manual is promote safety and efficiency. Another word for efficiency is mobility. Can you do those things? Are those goals compatible? Not really, okay? If you really want to make something safe, you generally have a lower level of mobility. And if you want to make something really mobile, you potentially have a lower level of safety. And that's probably one of the greatest struggles a traffic engineer has, is trying to balance safety and mobility. Orderly movement of traffic, national uniformity, that a device you see in Portland, Oregon, is if you come visit me in College Station, Texas, that same device would look the same, mean the same, and be used in a similar manner. And then introduce new ideas in a deliberative manner. Because a lot of things people will come up, I've got the greatest idea for traffic control since sliced bread, and on paper it may look really good, but you don't want to implement on a widespread basis, because either it might work really well for a short period of time, but when you put something out there, you want it to last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It depends on what the device is. You don't want something that's going to wear out after a year or two. So what are our challenges? It's a very large and complex document. Shortly, a few months after 2009 manual came out, there were some erroneous reports in the media about some of its content, and there's a video clip of a reporter holding it up saying this 862-page of federal bureaucracy is killing America, kind of statement, which wasn't true, but it is more complex, has a lot more detail, and it's harder to use. Although some of the recent revisions that were made over the summer have made that a little bit less of a problem. What's the first rule of communication? Know your audience, okay? So you can write or speak to your audience. It wouldn't do me very much good to stand up here and talk about retroreflectivity, because I doubt that any of y'all have been educated about the principles of retroreflectivity. So I'm not. I'm talking about general MUTCD principles. The problem is we've never defined who the MUTCD is written for. This document has been around since 1935, and we've never said the intended audience for this is a licensed engineer or a certified technician or a designer or a layperson or an attorney or a contractor. We've never said who we've written this document for. And the MUTCD ends up in the courtroom a lot. It is the only traffic engineering document that is defined as a national standard in the federal code. It is a legal document. Attorneys know this document better than traffic engineers. And they can take what seems to be clearly written MUTCD language and use it to make a point that's, in many cases, completely opposite of what the original intent of that language turned out to be. So it's time to look at the future and figure out what's going on. We've got PEDs and bikes that have changed in the last 5 years, new materials, that's the retroreflectivity stuff, a lot more regulation. Politics has crept its way into traffic control device decision making in a lot of places. And budget cuts in a lot of areas have reduced the number of staff that are really knowledgeable about making traffic control device decisions, which has led to a desire for the MUTCD to have more specific steps about what to do, because that way someone who doesn't know what they're doing can just read the book and follow the steps. Where are we going to go in the next, I don't know, 15, 20 years? Well, likely we're going to see some sort of communication between devices and vehicles, although to what extent I'm not real sure, and that's probably only going to be limited to certain roads, and certainly that also requires a complete turnover of the vehicle fleet at some point, which is probably not totally going to happen. We may see some enhancements to night visibility. Recent report or press release, actually, I read, talked about some glow-in-the-dark pavement markings in the Netherlands. That technology is not ready right now. It's not anywhere close to being ready, but it's being talked about. And we may actually see things where vehicle positions can be tracked using GPS or other devices, Bluetooth. We're collecting data on vehicle movements using Bluetooth. We don't know who the vehicles belong to, but we can trace travel time through a corridor by Bluetooth connections on some of our research projects. So we're looking at the manual future. It's been tried before. The only really successful one was in the 60s. And I chair a task force which almost a year ago got a small amount of funding to allow me to visit some professional meetings and create a website and so forth. What's the objective of that group? To figure out what the MUTCD should be in 20 years or so and develop a strategic plan to get there. By what should be, I'm talking about what's its purpose, who's it intended to be written for, what's the optimal structure, what's the best way to communicate. We're not really dealing with detailed content, we're just dealing with the big picture issues. It's a 100,000-foot perspective. And as I said, if you have a question, well, are you addressing something about bike lanes? I know that's a real hot topic here. In this strategic planning effort? My answer is no. We're not dealing with technical content. We're dealing with strategic issues. Okay, so here's our website. I would encourage you, all of y'all to go to this mutcd.tamu.edu. and read some of the white papers. There's 6 of them. I'll talk about them, I think, in the next slide. Feel free to comment if you have an opinion on this process. You could certainly submit a comment and say whatever you think should be the future of the MUTCD. The comment process of the project that I'm doing for NCHRP is actually a critical effort in this overall plan development, because it started out as a National Committee task force, and the National Committee really knows what it's doing, or at least I believe it does. I think some people might disagree with me every now and then. But we are a consensus-based group with a variety of perspectives. We have state agencies, city agencies, county agencies, we have researchers, we have industry, we have law enforcement, we have human factors, we have rail, we have contractors, we have a whole lot of different perspectives. We even have motoring groups like AAA as part of our policy board group that get to vote on proposals that establish our official positions on MUTCD content. And so while getting thoughts from that group is very valuable, the manual impacts more than that group, and that's why we wanted to reach out with this NCHRP project to a broader group, and that comment page is how we do it. I've actually been going around making a more detailed presentation about this than I'm giving y'all. The last one I did was Wednesday. Was that about 45 minutes? I think I spoke for about 45 minutes before we even started discussions. And I did not have a lot of the introductory stuff. I got into some more detail on other issues. All these presentations are either already on my website or will be if they would have been done in the last couple of months. But the basic approach I'm following: defining critical issues, and then writing a white paper on that issue or each of the issues. The white papers are generally 1 or 2 pages. I'll show you one on the next page. And then people comment on those, and I use the positions established in the white paper along with the comments on those white papers to figure out what to put in the vision. It's great to have an opinion, and it's really easy to form an opinion. Now, I'm an engineer, and I tend to think in a very deliberate way. When one of my kids comes up to me and says, "What do you think about, some national issue?" I'll go, "Well," and I'll pause and I'll think about it and I'll lay my facts out and I'll lead to a conclusion. They ask my wife, and she's got an instant opinion, and usually it's right. My wife is pretty smart. But she makes very quick statements. What I found, though, is sometimes those quick responses to questions like some of the ones I'm going to ask aren't very well thought out. And by writing down all of the issues in these white papers, it focuses one, either in the writing process or the reading process, to think what the issues are and to go through the logical issues and the positions and everything else to figure out whether a final position is reasonable or not. We live in a country of 10-second sound bites, but you really can't make good decisions on 10-second sound bites. You have to be thoughtful and productive in your approach. So here are the 6 white papers that have been posted so far. What is the purpose of the MUTCD? And this is really something we've never established. It could be, in fact, I think in its early days, in 1935 when it first came out, traffic control devices took whatever appearance the person that made them wanted them to look like. I have this history of the MUTCD that kind of traces traffic control devices from the early part of the 20th century to today. And back in the teens and 20s, things looked completely different than they do today in many ways. A lot of 2-color traffic signals. Some traffic signals had as many as a dozen different indications on them. They weren't always round. So we've come a long way, and one of the reasons we established the first MUTCD was to get things to look the same. A curve sign ought to look the same on any highway in the United States. That makes sense. A traffic signal should look the same at any intersection in the United States. A red should always mean stop. Yellow should always mean try to stop, although if you ask kindergartners what yellow means, usually they say speed up, because that's what their parents do. And the green means go. And those sort of things, we have to have national uniformity on that, and that's why the manual was originally created. But has the role of the manual grown to the point where we are trying to establish exact requirements for things like placement and operation and maintenance and a whole bunch of other stuff? That's what we need to figure out. Who are we writing it for? Is it an engineering document, or is it a professional document, or is it a layperson document, a legal document? We've got to figure that out. Otherwise, we can't be effective in using it over time. How detailed should we get? This national committee that Chris mentioned and I've mentioned meets twice a year. There's 250 to 300 people that come to each meeting, and for 3 days we sit down and discuss how to write regulations for traffic control devices. Very geeky group, I admit. I find most of the discussion stimulating, although every now and then I get bored out of my mind trying to listen to some of them, because they can get really wrapped up into some pretty subtle and what would seem to most people just really trivial issues. But they're not trivial issues. Some of them are very important. But should it be in the manual or not? We haven't figured all that out. If we're going to work toward a long-term goal, which the manual never really has done, it's only looked as far as what changes do we need to make to what we have today. And its changes have come on a piecemeal basis. We've never had a long-term target. We need to kind of get some idea of where we're headed with the future. How should we organize it? Right now, it's a very stovepipe organization. Part 1, introduction. Part 2, signs. Part 3, markings. Part 4, signals. Part 5, low-volume roads. Part 6, temporary traffic control. Part 7, schools. Part 8, grade crossings. Part 9, bicycles. The problem is, if you're designing an intersection or traffic control for an intersection, what exists at an intersection? Let's say a signalized intersection. Well, you've got a traffic signal, and you have pedestrian signals, and you have crosswalk markings and a stop line and lane lines and channelizing lines and turn arrow markings and advanced warning signs like a signal ahead sign, and left lane must turn left or right lane must turn right, or arrow lane use signs, left turn signal sign, no right turn on red sign. You may have a school crossing sign and special school crossing treatment. If there's a grade crossing nearby, you have preemption issues. You're dealing with the manual across all these parts, so maybe a better structure is to approach it by application as opposed to type of device. And what about our users of the system, the traffic control devices? Should we be trying to design those road use or the traffic control devices to accommodate everyone that's going to be out on the road? And a lot of people say, yeah, that's your quick thought. Yeah, we ought to accommodate everyone. Well, does that include the 15-year-old driver who doesn't have a license, who just stole a car and is going down a road 45-mile-an-hour speed limit at 70 miles an hour? He also had a little too much to drink and has a blood alcohol content of 0.14. And by the way, he happens to be going in the wrong direction on the road. Should we be designing our traffic control to accommodate that driver? I don't think so. So where do we back down from all users? If we're designing for all users, how many different languages do we need to put our signs in? Because in Texas, there is a significant proportion of the population that does not speak or read English. And it's not just Spanish language in certain parts of Texas. So that creates a lot of challenges. And you go on. Then you get into issues like non-vehicular traffic. I know bicycles, Peter was showing me earlier today a lot of the treatments, and it looks really good. On the Texas A&M campus, longboards are becoming a very popular way to get around. And I called one a skateboard once, and I was quickly corrected that it's not a skateboard, it's a longboard. So, you know, how do we deal with that in our traffic control? This is the typical white paper I was talking about, and I always put this in here because when people hear about a professor that's written a white paper, they think, oh, that's going to be really long, really detailed, it never would want to read it. These things are intended to be a quick read, okay, 2 pages. Sometimes comments by the panel and task force may spill over onto a 3rd page, but they tend to be comments, not actual writing. So in the future, and some of this may be addressed to a little extent in some of the white papers, but this is stuff I'm looking at writing more white papers on. How should we divide it up as far as standards, guidance, options, or by different activities, meaning, appearance, operation, installation, so on and so forth. I mentioned the rulemaking process. Should some of the content not have to go through rulemaking to be changed? That's a very legitimate question that we're struggling with. How do we decide whether a particular issue is important enough to put in the MUTCD? Right now, there are no criteria. It's if you get enough people to agree, then it goes in the manual, and if you don't, then it doesn't. But it seems like we ought to have some sort of basic threshold that you have to pass before you actually get into the manual. It's kind of like admission standards for college, okay? Before you have an opportunity to flunk a class, you have to prove you're good enough to get into the class. And maybe you flunk it, maybe you make an A, you don't know, but you got to have the basic requirements to get into the program. Let's see, what's the next one? How often should it be revised? Is 8 years often enough? Right now, the practice tends to be a major total new edition every 8 years, and there's a lot of changes. And in between, there might be 1 or 2 really, really minor issues that get revised. Or I shouldn't say minor, limited. If we're going to change something in the manual, how much research or other reason do we need to have? Is it good enough just to have a group of experts just sit around and say, yeah, let's change this, which is how the process works today and has always worked. All these great new ideas, new technologies. Here in Portland, your signals with a little bicycle emblem in the lens. That's not in the MUTCD right now, okay? How much should you be able to do that sort of thing without it being in the manual? And how can we better present the document? Right now, it's about yay thick. It weighs a lot. I don't bring it to meetings. At one time, I did because we didn't have any other way to see content. Now I carry it around on my phone. So if somebody says, well, what is in Section 2C26? Or what does that section say about a particular issue? It's not easy, but I can bring it up on my phone and read it. About a month ago, FHWA put a notice, or it's actually a request for comments in the Federal Register and said, we want to split up the MUTCD and put it in 2 documents. Give us your comments on that. And so without going into a whole lot of detail, because this is one of those things you kind of got to understand the MUTCD. But basically, they're saying, all right, the new MUTCD would be all the standards, and depending on where they go with option A or option B, one might include a little bit more than standards. And that's the only part that would go through rulemaking, and that's what FHWA would have as the manual. The National Committee has already submitted a response about that and has said, you know, there may be value in splitting it, but let us finish the strategic planning process before you actually decide to take those steps. So I'm in the process of actually writing this long-range vision right now, and I'm hoping to get it posted late April, maybe toward the end of May, somewhere in that month-long time frame, into April to end of May, and to define the different things that myself and the panel task force that I'm working with feel like is the future of the MUTCD. And we'll put that on the website and let people start commenting. I'll be making presentations this summer, and the strategic plan will accompany the vision. That's how do we get from 2009 to 2033, the ultimate vision that we have for 2033. I've got a series of questions here, and I'm going to go through this over the next 4 slides, and at that point, we're going to open it up to discussion. We can talk about these questions or any of the other part. But this is kind of stuff just to get your brain going. What do you think traffic control devices will look like in 20 years? Will it be like the Jetsons cartoon, where everybody's floating around in flying cars and you don't see any signals or signs or anything? Or is it basically going to be the same thing we have today? Okay, for many of you, the question may be, what kind of environment will your children be learning to drive in? And is there a concept, and this is an evolving idea in my own mind, of a uniform standard versus a consistent standard? So maybe some of our standards are absolute and cannot be violated, very precise. But then we have other standards that are targets. You know, it's something to shoot for. This is what we want you to do, but if you have a good reason not to, it's okay to go in a different direction. And that's, as I said, a uniform standard and a consistent standard. And I'll add, maybe exact standards apply to things like the meaning of a device and what it looks like, but a consistent standard might be where it's placed. You know, it always needs to be at least on the right side of the road, but exactly where on the right side is a sphere that you make a decision about. Who should be making these decisions? Is someone whose specialty is traffic engineering the only one that really ought to be making traffic control device decisions? Or in some of these municipalities, that some of them can be pretty small, they don't have any kind of traffic expertise. They have some elected official, a city councilman, or the road superintendent who has been trained to drive a grader because most of their roads are unpaved, but has no engineering background. Can those people make decisions about traffic control devices? How can we kind of balance that need? I think there are some things in the manual that are specific enough that you can hand them to a non-engineer and say, deal with this device. But there are other parts of it that do require engineering knowledge. How are we going to find the group of road users that we are trying to accommodate? One of the points that Peter made this morning during our tour that I thought is very, very true. On low-speed roads, and that's generally 40 miles an hour and lower, it's okay to have mixed modes. You can have bicycles and cars sharing the same roadway. But when you get in a high-speed environment, they need to be separated. Bicycles don't belong on roads where the cars are going 45, 50, or more miles an hour. Same thing for pedestrians. And so can we work that structure into the MUTCD? I talked about this one. Can a bunch of experts, are they qualified to be the sole deciders of what's appropriate to be in the manual, or do you need to actually have some data to support what you're doing? And how often is it appropriate? If we're going to revise the manual and do major changes, what's the limit on what can effectively be dealt with? What's it going to look like in 20 years? I tend to think it's going to be an electronic document. Everybody will be looking at it on their tablets. And if we're going to split in two, what's the best way to decide? So I did pretty good on my time. We've got a little over 20 minutes left. I think at this point, Chris, you want to go ahead and get into the questions?
So you mentioned in the very beginning, you know, your little anecdote about the red stop sign versus a green stop sign that someone wants to blend in with the surrounding settings. Have you had, so I have a question, it's kind of detailed, but it seems kind of foundational as well. Has there been any discussion of like color blindness? Because, you know, to some people red and green looks the exact same.
That's a really good question, and that goes toward the question I ask is what's the group of road users that we are designing these devices for? We don't really say much in the manual about road user characteristics. Now, we have taken steps to try and deal with color blindness as an issue in our design of traffic control devices. First of all, what's the most common form of color blindness? Anybody know? Red-green. That's bad news when you're looking at traffic signals. So what do we do with traffic signals with the red-green issue to try and help people that are colorblind? We have well-defined positions for the signal indications. And in pretty much every place but Texas, signals are vertical. In Texas, they're horizontal. So red's either always on top or on the left. It used to be, oh, yeah, the sign, oh, yeah, that's why that picture is funny. These are, you know, there's something wrong with all of these. I took every one of these pictures, by the way. I can tell you where I found them if somebody was really interested. I take that back. I did not take the rail crossing. One of my students took that. When he was working at TTI, he was one of my student workers, and he saw it, and he gave me the picture. When we were using incandescent signals, the signal lens had some blue added to it in order to help drivers distinguish that color from the red. Now, as we've gone toward LEDs, we've lost some of that blue color that was part of our incandescent. And I'm not sure, and I haven't really looked into this issue, I don't know if the red-green color blindness aspect is more of a problem with LED signals than it was with incandescent or not. But that's one of the things that we do for color blindness. And as far as signs go, we have shapes, well-defined shapes that indicate the difference between a regulatory sign, a warning sign, or a guide sign. And we try not to mix the colors and shapes to where it would be easy for someone to mistake one type of sign message from another. And we generally don't use red and green pavement markings, although the green for bicycles is a growing color. It probably seems normal here in Portland. I will tell you, you're the outlier in that regard. Very innovative here, but hasn't really been used a lot of other places. How many people are going to have a question? Because that may control how, okay, I better have shorter answers.
I had a question about the restructuring of the document, and you mentioned that you were considering moving from the current organization to an application.
Potentially.
And I was curious some of the frameworks or issues that came up with that in terms of, you know, would it be intersection typology, or how would that work?
Well, okay, the simple answer is I don't know. Keep in mind the manual as it was originally written was largely written by people that were affiliated with state transportation agencies. At the time they were called highway departments. And its roots are in highway traffic control. And the urban traffic control, although it's been part of it since 1935 because traffic signals are in there, a lot of the local people, even up into the 2000 manual, were saying this is a highway-focused document. And part of the reason why the content has grown so much is trying to deal more with the urban environment. The problem is the urban environment is so varied that it's very difficult to write general rules that applied with precision everywhere. And so you have to start writing exceptions. Well, you write exception for this, and then you got to write another exception for that. So haven't worked through all the details. One of the things I'll have to do when I have an idea that I'm comfortable with on structure, which I hope is at the end of this month, is to start putting together some outlines and examples of content. Well, you got the microphone. Where do you? Okay, up here.
So you discussed, or you mentioned that one of the questions is, do we have a panel of experts making the decisions, or do we have data? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what kind of data or research you're thinking about.
Well, the National Committee right now works with FHWA, and the way language gets into the manual at the current time typically is there's an idea somewhere, and someone tries it out, does a little experiment. They may or may not write a report about their experiment. Their experiment may or may not have detailed data, depending upon whether it's an actual research project or just something some city or state tried out in the field. And then the National Committee will take an idea that comes from someone or the results of some experiment and try and write MUTCD language. The National Committee people are actually pretty knowledgeable. They all deal with traffic control in some way or form or fashion. And they know of what they speak. But sometimes they're making judgment calls that, here are some issues. Maybe the research or the experiment only had one or two sites. Well, it's hard to make a national judgment based on results from one or two sites. And so you have to, generally there's been some expert opinion that weighs into developing that MUTCD language. I was telling them this morning that I have an article from a 1962 newsletter from my dad, who's also a traffic engineer, that one of his colleagues was saying we need more research to support the changes we make to the MUTCD. We need to rely on research more. Well, they weren't doing it in '62, and they're still not doing it to that great of an extent today. They're just not the level of funding out there to support the need to have detailed data on every decision that goes into MUTCD language.
You mentioned earlier in the presentation that politics is starting to enter the process. I wonder if you could provide a example of that.
Okay, I can give you several. If you look in the back of the 2009 manual, there is a statement that says the red, white, and blue center line in, I think it's Bristol, Rhode Island, I've forgotten the exact city, somewhere up on the East Coast, complies with the MUTCD. Now, why is that statement in there? Well, because somewhere in the 80s, I think it was the 80s, they striped their center line red, white, and blue for the bicentennial in '76. And then in the 80s, someone told them they had to change it because of what was in the MUTCD. Well, they got their congressman to pass a law that says their red, white, and blue center line marking complies. In '92, Congress included language in the DOT Appropriations Act that says the Secretary of Transportation shall revise the MUTCD to include a minimum standard of retroreflectivity for all signs and markings used on all roads open to public travel. Well, the sign retroreflectivity was added in 2008, so it took 16 years, but it was done. Pavement marking retro requirements have been proposed but not finalized. Then 2004, 2006, I don't remember the exact year, somewhere in that time frame, Congress passed a law that says the Secretary shall revise the MUTCD to allow pharmacy signing on the specific services or logo signing. Now, Oregon has changed or has a state supplement that took the pharmacy signing out, so you don't see it in Oregon. But in some states where it'll say food, lodging, gas, attractions, and camping. Those are the 5 previous services that could be signed for. Pharmacies is the 6th. Because the law, as Congress wrote it, said access to a pharmacy is critical in the case of an emergency of some sort. It was just an advertising mechanism for a particular retail pharmacy company. But that's how that stuff happens.
And we have our, in Oregon with the stop sign, with the sign below it that says, except when turning right at some places. That's in the appendix, so approved. Nowhere else can you do that. That was approved. One of our congressmen slipped that in so we could leave that goofy sign up. So, terrible sign.
It sort of ties in with the policy stuff as well, but I was curious about non-compliance and what the repercussions are or who the enforcing body is.
We were talking about that this morning, and I probably could, within a couple, 3 minutes, pull up some very entertaining slides of the MUTCD police, which a couple of us have used those in presentations at times as a joke, because there is no enforcement of the MUTCD criteria. How do you think the MUTCD criteria, or why agencies want to comply with the MUTCD? The what? Litigation. That's the primary reason. That if you don't follow the standard of care, that you're going to be liable when something bad happens. Okay, now, there is a potential that FHWA will withhold transportation funding from a state that doesn't comply. So that's FHWA's stick, if you will, to encourage MUTCD compliance. But FHWA doesn't really work directly with local agencies. So they're not getting money directly from FHWA. And so at the local level, it's really compliance issues, or if they have an insurer that tells them they need to comply in order to maintain their insurance premiums at a reasonable level. And I'll add one more thing to that. OSHA will enforce some of the MUTCD criteria for work zones.
I have a few questions. One is, how is the MUTCD funded? And also, I'd like to hear a little bit more about how the committee members are chosen, and if there are guidelines in the MUTCD about that process.
Okay.
And how many are there?
All right. How is it funded? Well, the MUTCD is owned by FHWA, okay? And there is a group of FHWA staff that are called the MUTCD team that have their sole responsibility, I shouldn't say sole, there's 2 or 3 of them whose sole responsibility is just working on MUTCD issues. And then there's 4 or 5 others that a significant part of their professional staff time is committed to MUTCD issues. And some of them are located in various places around the country. FHWA, through its own budget, is responsible for the staff time to make the changes and to manage and administer the MUTCD. There's no line item budget. Congress doesn't approve anything that says the amount of money that goes to the MUTCD is X dollars per year. Now, the National Committee is an independent private organization. It has existed in one form or another since that very first MUTCD. In fact, the first MUTCD was created by the Joint Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And it changed in makeup and time over the years, but there's always been this independent group. When they created the 35 manual, there's just 2 organizations. Today, the National Committee has 20 sponsoring organizations. The council, which is the body that votes, is like the board, has 39 members from those 20 sponsoring organizations. Now, AASHTO, which is the state highway agencies and ITE each appoint 8 members out of that 39. The county engineers and APWA, American Public Works Association, each appoint 3. So assuming those all represent public agencies, and they pretty much do, that's, what was that, 22 of the 39 come directly from a public agency perspective. Then there's groups like the railroad, the industry, human factors, AAA, law enforcement, a number of others, a safety group, that make up the remainder of those 39 individuals. In order for something to pass the council and to be approved as an official national committee position or policy, it has to have 2/3 support of the 39 members. So did I answer all of your questions? Close enough? Okay. Yes?
So you mentioned a couple times about the sort of innovation of bike signals in Portland, and maybe we've got some trial and error going on. So I'm curious if those get incorporated into the manual, how do you get further innovation, or once those are codified, is there a process for continuing to explore best practices?
That's a dynamic situation that changes over time. Okay, engineers are very good at finding solutions that work, and that's what engineers do. They solve problems. Sometimes those solutions may or may not comply with the set of rules that might have been written 5, 10, 40, whatever years ago. There's actually a publication called the Bikeway Design Guide. The NATCO publication. Urban Bikeway Design Guide, I think is what it's called. And some of the stuff in there actually does not comply with the MUTC or some aspects of MUTCD principles. But it's been received by many communities in a very positive light. So it may have solutions that are advancing the incorporation of bicycling and bicycles as a mode of transportation into the local community livable concept. But some of the people that are very hard line about the importance of the manual and sticking to MUTCD principles don't like that document because some of its content doesn't comply. And that's just something that has to be worked out over time. That's why people like Chris and myself and others at universities do research. That's why practitioners try new things.
That was kind of part of my question as well. Is there any plans for protected bike lanes as opposed to just standard bike lanes? And is there any, you mentioned that county transportation officials were part of this board, but not city transportation officials. And so I feel like there's kind of a lack of the city perspective in some of these designs. So is there any potential for borrowing from NACDO and the Urban Design Guide and incorporating some of that?
Okay, you see, y'all are starting to get into specific content that gets beyond the strategic planning issue. The strategic planning part isn't dealing with those kind of questions. So I have to answer that as a member of the National Committee based on personal experience, not from the strategic planning. There are city transportation professionals on the National Committee. ITE, a lot of the ITE members come from cities. The APWA people are typically city. ASCE's representative works for the city of Milwaukee, for example. So cities are well represented at the National Committee. It's sometimes difficult to reach that 2/3 opinion because some issues are very divisive. And the retroreflectivity one that I mentioned was a good example. The public agencies did not want to see it because of the demands it would make on their budgets and their increased liability. And safety and industry did want to see it because of perceptions of increased safety and greater sales for traffic control devices. So sometimes it takes a lot of work to reach compromises. And MUTCD changes occur at a glacial pace. You can watch the dew form on the grass as this stuff happens. It's very slow.
I had a question from one of our web viewers about how, and you sort of alluded to it a little bit there, how does the cost issue of some of these changes get brought up in the discussions?
Really good question. Part of the rulemaking process requires an assessment of the economic impacts. And by and large, most of the changes that are made to or proposed to the MUTCD, FHWA determines that those changes can be implemented on a maintenance basis. In other words, when the current devices wear out, you put in new ones that comply. And so there is no economic impact to MUTCD changes. Other than with retroreflectivity, I've never seen a formal economic assessment associated with any MUTCD change. And whether that is, there actually is an economic impact or not depends on who you talk to. A lot of agencies will claim, for example, some of the changes that were in the last manual regarding overhead guide signs, if implemented right away, would require a new sign structure. The whole sign bridge that spans the freeway in order to support the sign, because it's a much larger sign, has heavier wind loads. That's not a trivial cost to do that. So it's a tough one to answer as to what the economic impacts are. And generally, traffic control is at the bottom of the budget priorities. It tends to be taken care of after capital improvements and staffing and a whole bunch of other stuff is done. So there's usually not an abundance of money for traffic control improvements. And I'll say I'll stay up here after this is over as long as the classroom's available. If there are others that have questions.
Since you're from Texas, I was going to ask if you had any preference on the vertical versus horizontal traffic signals. Or
I thought you were going to ask me if Johnny Manziel was going to win the Heisman again. No. I can tell you why I have been told the horizontal came about. Texas has a long coastline, and they had a lot of problems with the vertical signal heads, which back in the days when all these regulations and manuals were being developed, when major storms would come into Texas, the vertical ones were being knocked off of the span wire or the mast arms, and they went to the horizontal mountings because it was anchored at both ends in a rigid mounting, and it was a lot more stable. It wouldn't sway in the wind or any of the other issues. You will see some vertical signal heads in Texas. I don't think it really matters. I think drivers are smart enough to adjust one way or the other. And I think drivers that have limitations, like a colorblind driver, or my dad who's decided not to drive at night, or those that may have a mobility impairment that know it takes longer to cross the street, make adjustments to their travel so that, like my dad, he doesn't drive at night. Somebody that has mobility impairment waits until the beginning of the walk to start instead of some of our students at A&M. I don't know what about here. There'll be 3 seconds left on the countdown timer, and there's 5 lanes to cross, and they'll just start walking out like it's a Sunday stroll, because there's still time left on it, and then they get mad at the cars when they honk at them.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. So, Stefan, I guess you're the...
So you already touched on this a little bit, but I was curious how long it takes to get something actually codified into the MUTCD. And also, I mean, you mentioned maybe the balance of whether or not having data-specific research to support changes and how that could affect that length of time, especially since another question you touched on was what will the MUTCD look like in 20 years, and with cars that might drive themselves coming sooner than we think. Can we keep up with those changes?
That's one of the biggest complaints about the MUTCD is it's not responsive to advances in technologies. And that's become more of an issue over the last 15, 20 years, is those technology advances have happened so rapidly. It's Moore's Law, I think, that the technology doubles every, is it 2 years? Something like that. I'll give you an example. The retroreflectivity that I keep talking about, because that was from early 90s up through about 2008, that was a big chunk of my research was sign and pavement marking retroreflectivity. Research started in the late 80s at FHWA. Congress passed the mandate in 92. TTI's research was, I think, 98 to 2002. Then we found problems with the original FHWA research that wasn't done right. We had to redo some of that. That change did not go into the MUTCD for signs until 2008. So 16 years after Congress passed the law, and we still haven't done the pavement marking part. With the manual only being published at roughly 7, 8, 9-year intervals, you typically, depending on when an issue comes up, are waiting at least 3 or 4 years, and sometimes as long as 8, 9, 10 years, because it takes about 2 to 3 years to prepare manual language. So, for example, if the next edition is going to be published in 2017, we're going to have to start working on it early next year. FHWA will, to get the language in the form and get it through all the approval processes and then go into the proposed rule, public comment, evaluation of the comments, publishing the final rule. So, yeah, those changes don't get implemented very quickly.
All right, before we thank Professor Hawkins, next week's speaker will be Kelly Clifton. She's going to be talking on the economics of bike sling. So thank you, Gene, for your talk today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. A very good